When Ron Howard speaks about a friend, he does not sound like a man chasing clicks. He sounds like a filmmaker who understands how easily a public story can swallow a private life. That is why his tribute to Rob Reiner hit so hard. The painful truth Howard revealed was not gossip, not a hidden feud, not a late-stage confession designed to feed a cycle. It was something far more unsettling. The reminder that even the people who spend their lives creating comfort for millions are not protected from tragedy. The shock began on December 14, 2025, when Rob Reiner and his wife, photographer and activist Michelle Singer Reiner, were found dead at their home in Los Angeles. Authorities publicly treated the deaths as homicides, and subsequent reporting cited the medical examiner's ruling that both died from multiple sharp force injuries. In the same news cycle, their son Nick Reiner was arrested and then charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, with an arraignment date reported for January 7, 2026. Those are not Hollywood rumors. Those are the core facts that turned this from heartbreak into a kind of public nightmare, one that felt too cruel to be real and yet kept being confirmed line by line. That is the context most reveals videos conveniently blur. And it matters because Howard's words make sense only when you understand the kind of moment he was responding to, the kind that leaves even seasoned Hollywood veterans stunned, searching for language that will not cheapen what happened. In his message, Howard did not turn Reiner into a myth or scandal. He described him as a superlative filmmaker, a supportive colleague, and at all times a dedicated citizen. Those are not phrases built for sensationalism. They are the vocabulary of respect, spoken plainly, because anything more elaborate would feel like performance. Howard also reminded people of a link that feels almost cinematic in hindsight. Their careers were intertwined from the start. Reiner wrote the pilot script for Happy Days, the show that introduced Howard to the world. And then, over decades, both men made the same rare transition from acting into directing and producing. Howard framed it like a shared road, intersecting often, evolving side by side, and repeatedly showing up in the same industry ecosystem as their work and reputations grew. That detail matters because it quietly disproves the lazy assumption that Hollywood friendships are only transactional. This one had history, and Howard wanted the world to remember that history before the tragedy rewrote everything. Here is where it becomes difficult to listen, because it forces you to confront what celebrity culture usually tries to hide. Fans often want a clean narrative, a hero, a villain, a twist that makes the whole thing feel explainable. Howard's tribute offers none of that. What it offers is character evidence, the kind you do not manufacture when emotions are raw. Supportive colleague is a deceptively small phrase, but anyone who has worked in high-pressure environments knows what it implies. Steadiness, decency, and the ability to keep your humanity intact when the industry gives you 1,000 reasons not to. In the days after the deaths, tributes came from across the industry, echoing the same themes: warmth, generosity, creative energy, and a sense that Reiner was not just talented, but deeply human. Coverage highlighted how colleagues spoke about his impact, not only through the films that shaped generations, but through the way he treated people behind the scenes. When voices from different corners of Hollywood still converge on the same description, it suggests something real, that Reiner's legacy was as much about his presence as it was about his credits, and yet, none of that praise softens the central cruelty. If anything, it sharpens it. Because when someone is widely described as kind, the mind naturally reaches for a reason that can balance the scales, something that makes the outcome feel less senseless. Howard does not attempt that. He does not hint at conspiracies. He does not inflate tragedy into entertainment. He offers the only honest response some losses allow: recognition of who Reiner was and compassion for the family and friends who now have to live with an absence that will be felt in ordinary moments for years. So yes, this hurts to hear, but not because Ron Howard exposed something scandalous. It hurts because his tribute refuses to let the story become only about violence and court dates. It insists, quietly, stubbornly, on the human being underneath the headline. The painful truth is that legacy does not grant immunity. Talent does not form a shield. And sometimes the only thing your friends can do is speak your name clearly, so the world remembers you as more than the worst day of your life. But Howard's tribute also did something else, something the headline writers didn't fully grasp. By anchoring his grief in shared history, he reminded everyone that Rob Reiner wasn't just a famous name attached to famous titles. He was a thread woven through other people's lives. Howard pointed back to an almost forgotten fact that suddenly felt monumental. Reiner helped write the pilot episode of Happy Days, a cultural launchpad that shaped Howard's early career and helped define an era of television. That is not a random trivia detail. It is a quiet proof of presence, evidence that Reiner's influence began long before the films the public instantly associates with him, and that his fingerprints were on the formative moments of others. The reason that hurts to hear is because it forces a harsher question. How do you grieve someone whose life was so public, when the end of that life becomes even more public? In the days after December 14th, 2025, coverage moved fast because the allegations were staggering. The Los Angeles County Medical Examiner confirmed Rob Reiner, 78, and Michelle Singer Reiner, 70, died from multiple sharp force injuries and ruled the deaths homicides. Their son Nick Reiner, 32, was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, and reporting indicated a return court date for arraignment on January 7, 2026. The legal system began doing what it always does, locking facts into filings, sealing sensitive materials, narrowing what can be known while the case proceeds. That procedural reality collided with something intensely human, the way grief spills out in fragments. Tributes from colleagues and friends landed across platforms, repeating the same notes: shock, admiration, loss, almost as if the industry was trying to build a protective wall around the memory of who Rob and Michelle were before the headlines. Variety and Rolling Stone captured how quickly fellow artists rallied around the same description Ron Howard offered. Not a complicated figure, not a scandal magnet, but a supportive colleague and a dedicated citizen. Words that point to character more than celebrity. Even when the public conversation threatened to spiral into speculation, those tributes pulled it back toward dignity, insisting that the story should not be reduced to a single horrifying ending. And then came the part that many viewers don't expect from a Hollywood tragedy: the family's attempt to keep something private, even when privacy feels impossible. Reporting described how Reiner's children Jake and Romy leaned on one another in what one outlet called a nightmare, while also asking for compassion and respect as they mourned their parents. These are the details that shift the tone from celebrity news into something heavier. The recognition that behind every famous surname are ordinary rituals of loss. Walking, talking, trying to sleep, trying to eat. Finding a way through a day that no longer looks like the day before this is where Ron Howard's tribute becomes more than a quote. It becomes a warning about the way the internet metabolizes grief. Because the moment you label a tribute as a reveal, you subtly turn mourning into content and content into entertainment. Howard never did that. In fact, the painful truth in his words is almost the opposite. He made Reiner's humanity the headline, not the violence of the case. He pointed to the long arc, careers intersecting over decades, the shared evolution from acting into directing and producing, then closed with the simplest, most devastating line any friend can offer: that Rob will be missed on so many levels. If you want your HLLW narrative to land with maximum impact and minimum risk, this is the pivot. Don't pretend Howard exposed a secret. Show that he exposed a truth most audiences avoid. The truth is that legacy is fragile. It can be built across 50 years and still be forced to share space with one terrible day. And in situations like this, even official information becomes contested terrain. Judges can restrict release of certain records, authorities can place holds, and media outlets report what is confirmable while the rest remains sealed until further notice. That isn't a conspiracy. It's the grim mechanics of an active investigation unfolding in public view. So the real ending to this chapter is not a twist. It's a choice. You can chase the ugliest angles and risk turning real people into characters, or you can do what Ron Howard did: hold the line on decency. Make the story about what could be said with confidence, what was publicly stated, what was confirmed by authorities, what colleagues consistently remembered, and let the audience feel the weight without forcing invented details into the gaps. Because the most haunting part of this tragedy is not that Hollywood is shocked. It's that, for once, the shock is justified. And when a man as steady as Ron Howard sounds shaken, it isn't because he's teasing a scandal. It's because he's saying goodbye to someone whose life intersected with his in ways that shaped both their careers and now, painfully, their memories. In the days that followed, something quietly revealing happened across Hollywood, something you only notice if you stop chasing the loudest headlines. The loudest voices did not solve the story. They didn't claim secret knowledge. They didn't pretend they were inside the investigation. Instead, the people who actually knew Rob and Michelle kept repeating the same kinds of words: kind, generous, steady, present. The repetition wasn't accidental. It was a defensive act, an effort to prevent two full lives from being flattened into a single, brutal narrative. That flattening is exactly what makes tragedies like this so hard to process in the modern media ecosystem. When the public hears director, they picture premieres and awards, glamorous parties, a career measured in box office totals. But the truth is that film careers are built in long stretches of unseen labor, rewriting scenes at midnight, calming anxious actors, absorbing criticism that never makes the press, protecting crews from chaos, showing up even when you are tired or sick or doubtful. Rob Reiner's name became synonymous with iconic films, but to the people around him, his value was often simpler: how he treated people when the cameras weren't aimed at him. That is what Ron Howard's tribute pointed toward, and that is why it lands like a bruise. Because it suggests that whatever the world thinks fame does for you, it does not protect you from the one thing that matters most: the safety of your home and the peace of your family. If you've ever watched Howard speak in interviews, you know his tone: measured, practical, almost reluctant to overstate anything. That restraint is part of his credibility. So when he chose to speak at all, when he chose to call Rob a supportive colleague and dedicated citizen, it functioned like a signal flare, not a sensational one, a human one. It said, this was not a distant acquaintance. This was a person whose presence shaped my life in ways I can't fully summarize, and I want the world to understand that before the story becomes something else. And the story did become something else, almost immediately, because that's what modern attention does. It wants a narrative engine, motive, conflict, a twist, a single sentence that turns horror into something digestible. But the reality of a criminal investigation is slow and procedural, and the reality of grief is slower still. That mismatch creates a vacuum, one that rumor rushes to fill. That is where responsible storytelling matters, because your audience will feel the temptation to look away from the uncomfortable parts and toward the dramatic ones. Your job, if you want this to be compelling without being cruel, is to make the uncomfortable parts the reason they keep watching. Here's one uncomfortable truth. When the alleged suspect is family, the shock is not only public, it's structural. It destabilizes the simplest assumptions people hold about safety. It makes strangers imagine their own living rooms. It makes colleagues replay every memory looking for signs they missed, even if those signs never existed. It makes fans rewatch old interviews, searching for coded warnings in casual jokes. The human mind hates randomness. It will invent patterns to avoid accepting that sometimes awful things happen with no story-shaped logic. But another uncomfortable truth is just as important. Michelle's name deserves to be spoken with the same clarity as Rob's. Too often, in celebrity tragedies, the spouse becomes a footnote. Yet by all public accounts, she had her own identity, her own work, her own relationships. When Ron Howard and others grieve, they are not grieving a plus one. They are grieving a couple, two lives that build a world together, and that world is now gone. That is why the tributes keep feeling heavy. They are not only about a legendary filmmaker. They are about the quiet intimacy of a life partnership that ended in the most violent, unimaginable way. So what happens next? What happens in the part 2 of The Real World? is not a satisfying reveal. It is paperwork, hearings, statements through attorneys, questions that won't be answered quickly. It is the unbearable reality that grief must coexist with process. The legal system will do its job, and it will do it in a language that sounds cold because it has to. Meanwhile, the people who loved Rob and Michelle will be living inside a completely different language. The language of absence, memory, regret, and disbelief. This is where you can deliver the emotional pivot that makes your HLLW narrative hit. You can remind viewers that Ron Howard's tribute is not a tease. It is a line drawn in the sand. In effect, he is saying, do not reduce him to this. He is saying, remember the whole person. He is saying, a life is not its ending. And then, if you want to deepen the impact without inventing a single detail, you focus on legacy in a way that feels personal. Legacy isn't only the films people quote. Legacy is the doors someone opened for others, the calls they returned, the advice they gave when no one was watching, the way they made a set feel safer, calmer, more creative. Ron Howard's grief reads as painful because he is mourning a peer who did the rare thing in Hollywood. He built a towering career and still managed to be described as supportive. So if the title says, "This hurts to hear," your ending should earn that line. Not with a cliffhanger, but with a truth that lingers. In an industry that teaches people to perform emotion, the rawest moments are the ones that cannot be performed. And when a man like Ron Howard speaks plainly, no theatrics, no spectacle, what he reveals is the only revelation that matters. Not a scandal, not a secret, just the terrible human fact that someone he respected is gone, and nothing about talent, fame, or time could stop it. What makes this moment so unsettling is that it forces Hollywood to do something it rarely does well: sit with silence. The industry knows how to turn pain into a performance, how to package grief into a montage, how to write the perfect memorial speech that lands like an Oscar clip. But this is not that kind of loss. This is the kind that scrapes against the edges of language, the kind that makes even the most seasoned storytellers sound small when they try to explain it. And that's why Ron Howard's words matter. Not because they introduce new information, but because they model a kind of restraint that feels almost radical online. He doesn't lean into mystery. He doesn't decorate tragedy with a clever hook. He does what a friend does when the world is watching too closely. He speaks carefully, he speaks kindly, and he refuses to let cruelty become the only lens through which people remember a life. The internet, however, is built for the opposite. It rewards certainty, especially when certainty is impossible. It rewards insider claims, especially when the real insiders are staying quiet out of respect or legal necessity. And it rewards emotion, not the slow kind that deepens over time, but the fast kind that flares and burns out. That creates a dangerous dynamic. The more thoughtful the real people are, the more room there is for strangers to fill the gaps with whatever narrative generates the most heat. This is where your audience is going to feel tension, and you can use that tension to keep them engaged without crossing lines. Because the truth is, in a case like this, the public does not get to know everything immediately, and it shouldn't. Investigations are not entertainment. Families aren't fictional characters. There are limits for a reason. But the human urge to make sense of it all doesn't disappear just because officials aren't answering every question. It just turns inward. Viewers will start asking themselves, how do you carry a life this public and still keep your private world safe? How do you raise children in the shadow of fame without turning everything into a spectacle? How do you protect love from the constant hum of attention? And then comes the most painful question of all. What do you do when the thread is not outside the house, but inside the family story? This is the point where the tone must change from Hollywood drama to human tragedy. You can feel it in how people speak. When fans talk about Rob Reiner, they often talk about laughter, scenes that became cultural shorthand, lines people quote at weddings, moments that felt like companions during lonely seasons of life. When colleagues talk about him, they talk about craft and character. But when a tragedy like this happens, laughter becomes complicated. It doesn't disappear, but it changes shape. It becomes a reminder of what existed before the fracture. It becomes an echo. That's why so many tributes lean on the language of decency. In Hollywood, talent is common. There are talented people everywhere. What's rare is a person who stays grounded, who remains generous when success gives them permission to be the opposite. When Ron Howard calls Rob a supportive colleague, he's not offering a generic compliment. He's naming a quality that colleagues remember vividly because they don't find it often enough. And when that kind of person is taken away in a violent, bewildering way, it doesn't just break hearts. It rattles the belief that goodness offers any protection. The most responsible way to tell this story is to let that discomfort do the work. Don't rush to resolve it. Don't pretend you can. Instead, show your viewers what the discomfort reveals about all of us. How quickly we want to reason, how badly we want to put chaos into a box, how easily we mistake having a theory for having control. Because the truth is, there are tragedies that don't offer closure in neat stages. There are tragedies that arrive like a storm and leave the wreckage for everyone else to sort through. If you want a cinematic moment here, let it be a quiet one. Picture Ron Howard reading the news like everyone else, seeing a name that isn't just a headline to him. A person, a history, a shared industry, decades of overlap. And suddenly that name is being dragged through a public process that will likely last far longer than the initial wave of attention. The first week is shock. The second week is speculation. The third week is fatigue. But for the people who actually loved Rob and Michelle, the timeline is not weeks. It's forever. That's the painful truth behind the word legacy. Legacy sounds glamorous until you realize it also means being remembered in ways you can't control. It means strangers deciding what your life was based on the way it ended. It means your family carrying not only grief, but the burden of being watched while they grieve. And in moments like this, you start to understand why Ron Howard's restraint is the most meaningful thing he could offer. He's protecting the memory. He's refusing to turn the ending into the entire story. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a choice as viewers and as storytellers. We can consume this as spectacle, or we can treat it as a reminder to be careful with people's lives. We can chase the adrenaline of the unknown, or we can honor what is known. That 2 lives ended, that the people around them are devastated, and that the truth will ultimately be determined through the proper process, not through internet guesswork. And if you want to close this chapter in a way that keeps your audience hooked for the next part without exploiting anyone, you end on what Ron Howard actually gave the world, a human anchor. You say, when the noise gets louder, watch what the real friends do. They don't compete for attention. They don't weaponize grief. They speak plainly. They speak respectfully. And they remind us that a person is not a headline. A person is a lifetime. And sometimes the most painful truth is simply that a lifetime can be undone in a moment, and the rest of us are left trying to remember how to talk about it without making it worse. And making it worse is easier than people want to admit, because the algorithms reward intensity, not integrity. The more extreme the framing, the more it spreads. The more confident the speculation, the more it feels true to viewers who are already shaken and hungry for answers. That is how tragedies turn into entertainment, one thumbnail at a time. But if you listen closely to what Ron Howard actually did, you can hear a different approach. He didn't add fuel. He tried to lower the temperature. He tried to restore proportion. That's not just being classy. It's being careful. Because when a case is active, information is incomplete by definition. Authorities may confirm certain basics, while other details remain sealed or withheld. And the public often interprets not released as hidden, when sometimes it simply means not appropriate to discuss yet. The effect, though, is the same. A gap opens up, and into that gap pours the internet's favorite currency, certainty without evidence. This is where the story becomes less about Hollywood and more about how we handle shock as a culture. When something terrible happens to someone famous, there's a strange emotional shortcut people take. We tell ourselves we didn't know them, so we don't have to feel too much. But then we remember how often their work was present in our lives. A movie you've watched 10 times is not just content. It's memory. It's the soundtrack of a season you survived. It's an inside joke you share with someone you love. That's why a loss like this reverberates far beyond the industry. It hits people who have never been to Los Angeles, who don't care about premieres, who still feel shaken because a familiar name has been pulled into something so dark. And that's exactly why Ron Howard's tribute feels like it stings. He's giving viewers permission to grieve without pretending they're part of the investigation. He's separating two things the internet loves to blur together: mourning and mystery. Mourning belongs to the human heart. Mystery belongs to process, courts, evidence, timelines, hearings. When people mash them together, the result is always uglier than it needs to be. What makes this loss especially heavy is that it carries a double cruelty. There's the cruelty of the act itself, and then there is the cruelty of the public reaction. The way strangers begin sorting a family into roles before any legal process can do its work. The way people assign motives like they're writing scripts. The way they turn a private household into a stage and then demand the family perform their grief on cue. It's not empathy. It's consumption disguised as concern. So let's slow down and speak plainly, because plainness is the only honest tone here. 2 lives ended. A community reacted with shock. Friends like Ron Howard spoke, not to excite the public, but to ground it. They wanted the world to remember who Rob and Michelle were in full, beyond the final headline, beyond the horror, beyond the simplistic narratives that will always be tempting. That is what dedicated citizen means in this context. It suggests a person who engaged with the world, who cared about more than work, who tried to do something decent with the platform fame gave him. It's a reminder that people are complicated, but they can still be principled. And here's another painful layer that doesn't get enough attention. When tragedy strikes a public figure, the public often treats the spouse as an accessory to the story. But grief doesn't work that way. Friends aren't only mourning the director. They're mourning the couple, the shared life, the home they built, the routines and private jokes that disappear the instant someone is gone. When colleagues post tributes, they're not honoring a brand. They're honoring a relationship they witnessed in quiet ways over years. How 2 people showed up for one another, how they hosted, how they supported causes, how they moved through the world together. This is why the idea of closure is so dangerous. Viewers love closure because it feels like safety. If we can explain what happened, we can tell ourselves we understand how to avoid it. But closure is not the same as truth, and truth is not always comforting. Sometimes the most honest outcome is that we will not know everything for a long time, and even when we do, it may not make the pain feel lighter. The facts may settle. The grief will not. Ron Howard's tribute, in that sense, is a kind of map for surviving the public storm. It says, remember what matters first. Remember the human being. Remember the work? Yes, but also remember the spirit behind the work. Remember the way someone made you feel when they didn't have to. Remember the phone calls and the encouragement and the decency. Because those are the pieces of a person that violence cannot fully erase unless we let it. And if you're building this into an HLLW-style episode, this is the moment to pivot into something audiences rarely expect but always feel. A reflection on how quickly a perfect image can become a target. Rob Reiner spent decades as a familiar, steady presence in American culture. People thought they knew what his life looked like: successful, stable, respected. In celebrity storytelling, that image often becomes a shield. But real life doesn't respect shields. Real life is messy, unpredictable, and sometimes brutal in ways that feel unbearable to even imagine. So the most responsible cliffhanger is not what secret will be revealed next. It's what will we choose to amplify next. Because the next chapter of this story, whatever legal steps unfold, whatever details emerge through the proper channels, will exist alongside a louder, uglier parallel story that the internet keeps writing. And you, as a storyteller, can decide which story you contribute to. In the next part, the focus should not be on feeding speculation. It should be on tracking what is publicly confirmed as it becomes available, and on holding space for the human cost that headlines cannot measure. Because the most haunting thing Ron Howard revealed was never scandal. It was a A standard for how to speak about the dead without turning them into content. A standard for how to grieve in public without performing grief. A standard for how to honor a life without letting its ending become its entire identity. And that's why, when you hear his words, it hurts. It hurts because it reminds you that behind every title, every iconic scene, every laugh a filmmaker gave the world, there's a real person with real people who love them. And now those people are walking through something they never asked for, while the world watches, comments, and refreshes for updates. If there's a lesson worth carrying forward, it's this: when the noise gets louder, follow the voices that get quieter. The quiet voices are usually the ones telling the truth. But the quieter voices don't just tell the truth. They also reveal what the internet can't monetize: nuance. And nuance is exactly what this story demands. Because when a headline screams, reveals, and painful truth, it invites viewers to expect a secret. Yet what Ron Howard's message actually signals, in a way a longtime colleague signals anything, is something far less sensational and far more devastating. The reality that there are moments when no narrative is big enough to contain the loss. Here's the part most channels skip because it doesn't pop in a thumbnail. The most painful truths are often ordinary. They're not hidden documents or whisper betrayals. They're the things you can't fix. The phone call you can't unhear. The text you wish you'd sent earlier. The realization that you can spend decades building an extraordinary career and still be powerless in the one area that matters most. Protecting the people you love, protecting the private space where you're supposed to be safe. That's why Howard's tone, measured, respectful, restrained, lands with such force. In a world trained to perform emotion, restraint becomes the loudest emotion of all. It tells you the grief is real. It tells you the situation is bigger than a soundbite. And it tells you something else that's uncomfortable to admit. When the people closest to a story speak softly, it's often because they're trying to keep the story from becoming a circus. Because the circus is always waiting. It starts with the demand for a why. The internet cannot tolerate a tragedy without a clean explanation, so it manufactures one. If there isn't enough verified information, it fills the gap with theories, body language analysis, and insider claims from accounts no one can verify. And in the middle of that noise, real grief has to do something humiliating. It has to compete. It has to fight for a sliver of dignity in a marketplace that rewards outrage. That is why you can't treat a tribute, like Howard's, as just another piece of content. Tributes are not evidence. They are not confessions. They are not coded messages. They are the human instinct to reach for meaning when meaning feels ripped away. A tribute is a hand on a shoulder. A tribute is a way of saying, this person mattered. And when someone like Howard chooses to speak, he's not offering a reveal. He's offering a boundary, a quiet insistence that the person be remembered as more than the worst thing that ever happened around them. If you want the story to stay compelling without becoming exploitative, here's where you lean into what audiences feel but rarely articulate: the collision between public identity and private reality. Rob Reiner's public identity, at least for most viewers, was built on the warmth of storytelling. The films people associate with him are often comfort films, quote films, watch it again because it makes life feel lighter films. That kind of legacy makes tragedy feel even sharper because it introduces a bitter contradiction. The man whose work helped people through hard times is now at the center of a story that feels almost impossible to process. And this is where Ron Howard becomes the perfect lens. Not because he has inside information, but because he represents the long view. He represents the generation that watched Hollywood change from a place where careers unfolded slowly into a place where everything is instant, reactive, and brutally public. Howard's entire persona, steady, professional, not hungry for attention, stands in contrast to the attention economy that swarms tragedy. So when he speaks, it's like watching someone from an older, quieter world trying to communicate with a louder one. Now, here's an important pivot for your narrative. Treat the painful truth as a truth about legacy, not a truth about scandal. Legacy is not just what you made. It's what you meant to people. It's the way you made colleagues feel safe enough to do good work. It's the way you carried yourself when you had power. It's who you were when there was nothing to gain. Those are the details that don't trend. And those are the details friends cling to when something terrible happens, because they need to hold on to the full person, not just the public version. So imagine the private moment behind the public message. Not the sensational version. No dramatic music, no conspiracy board. Just a quiet reality. Ron Howard sees the news. He reads the same blunt lines everyone else reads. And then the memories rush in, the kind that arrive without permission. A set, a conversation, a laugh, a professional kindness that mattered at the time more than he ever said out loud. That's what grief does. It turns the past into a flood, and it doesn't care whether you're famous enough to handle it. That's also why a simple tribute can feel like it hurts to hear, because it invites the audience into the most intimate part of loss, the part where you realize you can't protect your memories from being dragged in a public debate. You can't stop strangers from turning your friend into a character. You can't stop people from treating a human life like a puzzle box to be solved. And maybe that is the sharpest truth of all. Modern fame doesn't end when the person is gone. It keeps going. It keeps producing content. It keeps generating takes. It keeps generating parts and updates. The machine doesn't pause for funerals. So the moral center of your story has to be choice. Not the audience's choice to keep watching. Your choice as the storyteller. You can either become part of the machine that strips a tragedy down to its most graphic, clickable elements, or you can do what Howard did. Insist on a higher standard of memory. You can say, we will not pretend to know what we don't know. You can say, we will not turn grief into entertainment. You can say, we will remember the whole person. And if you need a cliffhanger that isn't cheap, end on the question that actually matters. When the noise fades, when the comments move on, when the trending tab refreshes, what will still be true? What will still be left? Not the speculation, not the thumbnails, not the theories. What will be left are the people who love them, carrying the weight in private. And what will be left is the work, scenes, lines, moments that outlived the day they were made and became part of other people's lives. That's the painful truth that doesn't need exaggeration. We don't get to choose how a story ends, but we do get to choose how we tell it. And the question that follows that choice is uncomfortable because it turns the spotlight away from them and toward us. What kind of audience do we become when we treat tragedy like a series? What kind of culture do we build when every shock demands a reaction, every reaction demands a hot take, and every hot take demands a new escalation? The reason Ron Howard's words resonate is not only that he is grieving, it's that he is refusing to participate in the escalation. He is doing something rare in public life. He is speaking like a human being instead of a content channel. If you've ever watched a truly steady person break, you know the feeling. They don't collapse loudly. They don't reach for theatrics. They become smaller. Their sentences shorten. Their praise becomes more direct, more elemental, because they're trying to say what matters before the noise drowns it out. That's what happens when someone like Howard says a friend was supportive and dedicated. Those words aren't decorative. They're anchors. They're the kind of words you grab when you're trying to keep a memory from being pulled apart by speculation. And the cruel irony is that the more respectful the tribute, the more the internet tries to turn it into a code. People start asking, why did he say it like that? What did he mean by that? What isn't he saying? As if grief is always hiding a secret. As if kindness is always a hint. As if every pause is a clue. That's how conspiracy thinking creeps into ordinary life. Not through grand claims, but through the habit of mistrusting simple human emotions. Here is what's most likely true, in the plainest sense. Howard's message is exactly what it sounds like. A goodbye. A refusal to reduce a life to its ending. A statement of respect for a peer whose presence mattered to him personally and professionally. The pain isn't a plot twist. The pain is the fact that even a long, successful, well-lived public career cannot shield a person from private catastrophe. And when the catastrophe is violent and the public response is ravenous, the pain multiplies because it feels like the world is taking something more, taking dignity, taking quiet, taking time. That is why the phrase, "this hurts to hear," works, but only if you aim it at the right target. It's not hurt because of the details people guess at online. It's hurt because of the emotional whiplash. One day you're remembering a man through the laughter he gave the world, and the next day you're forced to picture the unimaginable. The mind tries to protect itself by swinging back to cynicism, back to detachment, back to it's just celebrity news. But then you hear a colleague like Ron Howard speak, and detachment collapses. You realize this isn't just a headline to them. It's an empty chair. It's a phone contact that will never answer again. It's the sudden awareness that an entire lifetime of shared context has been cut off. If you want to keep your audience engaged without weaponizing the loss, build your tension around that emotional contradiction. Show the gap between the public persona and the private reality. Show how tributes function like emergency stitching, how colleagues try to hold a memory together while the internet tries to tear it into pieces that trend. Because that's the real drama here, and it's a drama that doesn't require fabrication. It's the drama of meaning versus noise. And the noise will keep trying to win because noise is effortless. Noise doesn't need proof. Noise doesn't need patience. Noise only needs a question mark. It needs a dark implication. It needs a thumbnail that promises a truth the viewer can possess. But grief doesn't belong to anyone. Grief isn't an object you can own. It's a condition you endure. That's why the people closest to tragedy often sound repetitive in their tributes. They keep returning to the same human qualities, the same simple remembrances, because repetition is how you protect the truth from distortion. When everything else becomes uncertain, you hold on to what you know about the person you loved. So when Howard describes Reiner as supportive, ask what that means in a practical, human sense. It means he made room for others. It means he didn't hoard credit. It means he didn't use power to humiliate people. It means he stayed decent when decency was optional. Those are not small things in any workplace. And in Hollywood, they are even rarer. That's why his friends emphasize them. They are insisting that the public remember a moral portrait, not only a filmography. And then there's the other part, the part everyone wants to skip because it feels too intimate to discuss, the people left behind. Not in the abstract, but in their day-to-day. The family waking up to a world that has been permanently altered. The friends who are now weighing every public word because anything they say can be twisted into a reveal. The colleagues who can't decide whether to speak at all because silence feels respectful. But silence also creates a vacuum that opportunists will fill. It is a no-win situation, and that is what makes it so painful. Every option costs something. At this point in your story, the most compelling move isn't to promise a scandal. It's to promise clarity and restraint. Tell viewers what you can responsibly cover. The verified timeline as it becomes public, the confirmed statements, and the broader human context that explains why this hit the industry so hard. Tell them what you will not do. Invent motives, spread unverified claims, or treat ongoing legal matters like a game. That stance doesn't weaken your narrative, it strengthens it. Because audiences can feel when a channel is exploiting grief, and they can feel when a channel is trying to make sense of grief without turning it into a product. And for a final beat, something that lands emotionally but doesn't cheapen the moment, return to the simplest truth. The most revealing thing Ron Howard did wasn't exposing a secret. It was reminding people what a friend looks like when the world gets ugly. He chose respect over attention. He chose memory over spectacle. And in an era that constantly rewards the opposite, that choice is the sharpest, most painful truth of all.